So let me bring up Dr. Nicole Richter from Rollins College.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I can start with this. Happy Pride, y'all. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to what will certainly be a hypnotic descent into the dreamlike, decadent, and deeply symbolic world of Vampyros Lesbos. Tonight's film isn't your typical horror feature. It's not even your typical vampire movie, or even your typical lesbian vampire film. Directed, as Tim mentioned, by the prolific and often polarizing Spanish filmmaker Jess Franco, Vampyros Lesbos is a psychedelic fever dream that drips with eroticism, art house surrealism, and queer subtext. Although it's on the surface, it's not really subtext, it's direct text. But beneath the surface of blood and lace lies a fascinating artifact of 1970s countercultural cinema and a landmark, if complicated one, in the evolution of the lesbian vampire film genre. To understand Vampyros Lesbos, we need to talk about the lesbian vampire trope, which predates this film by nearly a century. Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novella, Carmilla, is widely considered the origin point of the lesbian vampire trope in Western literature and cinema. You can't hear? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Can you hear? Perfect. Awesome. It predates Dracula by 25 years and has profoundly influenced both vampire mythology and representations of queer female desire. Carmilla is a beautiful, aristocratic young woman who forms an intense, intimate bond with the protagonist Laura. She is later revealed to be a centuries-old vampire preying on young women. A quote from the story. "I have been in love with no one, and never shall," Carmilla tells Laura, "unless it should be with you." This line, and many like it, makes the story one of the earliest works in English literature to depict lesbian desire, albeit coded and veiled in horror. In a time when open discussions of homosexuality were taboo, Carmilla used vampirism as a metaphor. The story allows readers to experience the forbidden thrill of same-sex attraction under the guise of gothic horror. That lesbianism is suggested and not confirmed is a technique that's later mirrored in many 20th century lesbian vampire films. While the story can be read as constructing the predatory lesbian trope, it also reveals a powerful emotional attachment, rare for 19th century depictions of same-sex love. Unlike Dracula, which is male-centered, Carmilla is female-driven, emotionally intimate, and framed around female experience and subjectivity. Sadly, and maybe predictably, in the end, queer desire is punished. Like many later queer-coded characters, Carmilla is ultimately killed by men, restoring the moral order. Her death serves as a warning against transgressive sexuality, reflecting societal fears of female autonomy and queer love. So Carmilla laid the groundwork for more than a century of lesbian vampire portrayals, especially in horror and exploitation films from the 1960s and 1970s. Her influence can be seen in Hammer's Karnstein trilogy, films like The Vampire Lovers, Lust for a Vampire, Twins of Evil, which are all directly based on Carmilla, and of course the film we'll be viewing tonight, Vampyros Lesbos. Lesbian vampire film theory examines how lesbianism is portrayed in vampire films, especially in horror cinema, and what these portrayals reveal about gender, sexuality, power, and cultural anxieties. It draws from queer theory, feminist film theory, psychoanalysis, and genre studies. I've written about one issue with the theory, bisexual erasure in the fact that many films called lesbian vampire films actually depict bisexual vampires, such as Blood and Roses, The Hunger, and Daughters of Darkness, as these female vampires express attraction to multiple genders. I'm happy to report that is not an issue with tonight's screening. The film lives up to its literal lesbian vampire film title in the character of Countess Nadine. So I will provide an overview of some of the key concepts in lesbian vampire film theory to help us understand the film that we'll be screening tonight. So number one, the lesbian vampire as a cultural threat. The lesbian vampire is often depicted as a predatory figure who seduces and corrupts innocent women. But she also represents a threat to heterosexual patriarchy, disrupting male control over female bodies and desire. This trope reflects societal fears of female independence, same-sex intimacy, and non-reproductive sexuality. 2, desire made visible. Lesbian vampire films often visualize female same-sex desire in ways that mainstream cinema avoids. These films make the unspoken or invisible visible, though often through sensationalism or fetishization. Desire is shown through touch, gaze, ritual, sometimes more so than in conventional lesbian dramas. 3, male gaze and eroticism. Most lesbian vampire films are directed by men and constructed through the male gaze. Lesbianism is frequently fetishized for heterosexual male pleasure, positioning the audience as voyeur. This dynamic can undermine genuine queer representation, but it also opens the door to queer reinterpretation. 4, repression and doubling. The lesbian vampire is often a mirror or double for the pure heroine, symbolizing her repressed desires. Their relationship can be read as a psychological split, one woman representing societal expectations, the other forbidden desire. These dynamics often play out in dreams, hallucinations, or trance states, emphasizing ambiguity. 5, pleasure and punishment. Lesbian desire is often punished in these films, usually through death, exorcism, or heteronormative correction. The vampire is rarely allowed to survive or find love. This reinforces moral panic around queerness. Yet, the erotic pleasure depicted is often so lush and central that it becomes the emotional core of the film. 6, queer readings and reclamation. Contemporary queer and feminist scholars reclaim these films as sites of queer potential, even if unintentional. Camp, ambiguity, and excess allow for subversive interpretations, challenging the original heteronormative intent. The lesbian vampire becomes a figure of power, desire, and resistance, not just fear. Scholars like Bonnie Zimmerman and Andrew Weiss argue that these characters embody queer-coded empowerment. And finally, 7, lesbian vampires as feminist figures. Scholars argue the lesbian vampire is not just a queer figure, but a feminist one. She refuses male control. She creates homosocial and matriarchal spaces. She disrupts heterosexual romance and marriage plots. And the lesbian vampire has long haunted the margins of genre fiction. She is seductive, she is dangerous, and she embodies anxieties about female sexuality, autonomy, and same-sex desire. But she is also a figure of liberation, someone who transgresses norms, refuses patriarchal control, and bites back. Vampyros Lesbos doesn't just inherit this trope, it refracts it through a wild, almost avant-garde lens, transforming it into something unforgettably strange. I'm excited to have you all see it. Vampyros Lesbos, directed by Jess Franco, is considered an important, albeit controversial film in the context of queer cinema for several reasons. While not a straightforward work of LGBTQIA+ representation or advocacy, it holds a complex place in film history due to its transgressive style, depiction of lesbian desire, and cult status. The director was not a queer filmmaker. He was a boundary pusher, one who used sex, style, and genre to test the limits of censorship and form. So what makes Vampyros Lesbos so important to queer cinema? Because here, the lesbian vampire isn't just a monster or a metaphor. She's the main character. Nadine, played by Soledad Miranda, isn't one-dimensional. She's powerful, mesmerizing, complex. She's not the villain in a cautionary tale. She's the center of desire. And what always strikes me about this film is the intense visibility of lesbian desire. At a time when lesbian characters were often either invisible or villainized in mainstream media, the film depicts lesbian eroticism overtly, placing queer desire at the core of its narrative. While the portrayal is undeniably filtered through the male gaze and exploitation tropes, the film provided a rare moment of female-female desire on screen in early 1970s cinema. It also diverged from traditional horror norms by portraying the vampire not only as a predator, but as a sensual, powerful woman in control of her own sexuality. Franco doesn't moralize Nadine's relationships. He doesn't explain her behavior away with tragic backstories or heterosexual trauma. Instead, he gives us long, languorous scenes where lesbian eroticism is treated not with judgment, but with fascination. What makes this film endure, especially in queer readings, is also its dream logic and its aesthetic delirium. There's really no other way to kind of characterize it. Mirrors, lace curtains, red lighting, really slow zooms, and this very unforgettable psychedelic soundtrack. These are not just stylistic flourishes, they create an atmosphere where the rational world dissolves, where identity, gender, and desire slip into something fluid and unknowable. In Vampyros Lesbos, time doesn't behave normally. Characters move like they're in a trance. Plot lines are elliptical, and sexuality is porous, less about labels, more about energy and exchange. This visual style invites a queer gaze, not in the modern identity political sense, but how it queers narrative itself. We aren't told how to feel. We aren't given closure. We're asked to feel our way through a series of charged images. Of course, this film doesn't escape critique. Franco's vision is undeniably fetishistic, and many feminists and queer scholars have rightly pointed out that Vampyros Lesbos was not made for queer audiences initially. But that's where things get interesting, because queer theory often reclaims and reinterprets texts not meant for us. Films like Vampyros Lesbos become sites of resistance and reinterpretation, where what was once exploitative can be reread as empowering or even radical. Vampyros Lesbos became a cult classic, especially within underground and LGBTQIA+ film communities in the 1990s and 2000s, when an interest in reclaiming queer-coded or subversively queer cinema grew. For queer viewers and scholars, the film offered a lens through which to examine how queer desire was projected, disguised, or fetishized in genre cinema. Franco's ambiguous, non-moralizing approach allowed some audiences to interpret the queer characters not merely as victims or monsters, but as liberated figures. For many queer viewers, Nadine represents not a predatory other, but a model of queer autonomy, a woman who refuses to explain, who seduces on her own terms, and who disrupts the heteronormative order by simply existing. So, as we begin tonight's film, I invite you to consider this. Is Nadine a villain or a liberator? Is Vampyros Lesbos a piece of exploitative pulp or a hidden gem of queer cinema? Or is it both? Like the vampire herself, the film is a contradiction, one that seduces and disturbs in equal measure. It's an object of fascination for scholars, artists, and midnight movie lovers alike. And whether you view it as erotica, horror, queer metaphor, or all of the above, it's impossible to look away. So, settle in, embrace the supernatural, and let yourself be bitten. Enjoy Vampyros Lesbos.